When the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth?
Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief.
May our testimonies be as deep and as strong as that of Jacob, who, when confronted by one who sought to destroy his faith, declared, "I could not be shaken."
Now in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, things start to heat up. As we said at the beginning of this week's lesson, location, 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 you're going to deal with division, and we saw Paul push unity. You're going to deal with intellectualism, and we saw a long conversation in chapter 1 and chapter 2 about that. But remember also, this is Sin City, and there's going to be some immorality issues you're going to have to overcome. And there's going to be some pride in terms of materialism and superiority as a result of how much you have versus what somebody else has. And those are challenges we're going to have to overcome as well. That's what he's going to start focusing on in the second half of this week's lesson, in chapter 5 and 6 and 7. In fact, in some ways it reminds me of what Jacob does in Jacob chapter 2. In the Book of Mormon. In Jacob 2, he decries their pride and their materialism. And then afterwards, he's like, man, if that were it, I'd be thrilled for you. It's like, those are the only things you had to correct. And those are relatively minor sins, so repent and you're good to go. But Jacob lamented, unfortunately, there are grosser crimes that I have to bring up. And it pains me. I wish I didn't have to talk about these things. And these were sins of immorality. That's what Paul is going to have to deal with next. And we see it right off the bat as we start chapter 5. Verse 1 and 2. It is reported, so I don't know for sure, it was in this letter that came from the house of Chloe. She was telling him about divisions. Well, is she mentioning this as well? It is reported commonly. So now I'm really concerned. There's enough of these reports that there's probably something behind them. There's a lot of smoke, so there's got to be some kind of fire. And what are these common reports reporting so commonly? Brace yourself. That there is fornication among you. And the word for fornication, we define that as any kind of sexual intimacy outside of marriage. But it's beyond even that. The Greek word translated fornication here is porneia. Can you hear the root there? It's going to be any kind of sexual sin, any kind of immoral behavior. And it's commonly reported that these kinds of immoral behaviors exist among you. And it gets even worse. And such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles. And those are the Gentiles. They don't even have the law of God to make them feel guilty for what they're doing. These Gentiles are shocked and horrified by the kinds of rumors they're hearing about you. That these are things that wouldn't even be named among them. They wouldn't dream of succumbing to this kind of fornication. And what is it? That one should have his father's wife. Whew, yikes. And by father's wife, we don't mean mother. That's even worse. That's incest. No, this is father's wife in terms of your stepmother. Your mother passed away, he's remarried, but now for whatever reason, you are, I don't even want to go there, okay? The Gentiles wouldn't even want to go there. And yet you, not only is somebody going there, but notice the next line, ye are puffed up and have not rather mourned, that he that hath done this deed might be taken away from among you. That is probably the worst part of all. You're puffed up. Now, this is a weird kind of pride. Are you proud of the fact that you have this kind of immoral person among you? Again, the fact that it's he that hath done this deed, thankfully it seems to be at least confined to a single instigator. Somebody has done this. But the fact you're puffed up, now I don't know if this is some kind of weird, misplaced kind of presuming upon God's grace like we saw in Romans, that, hey, we're Christians and put it on Jesus' tab, so that guy shouldn't be punished. Or is it some kind of other kind of pride where we're proud of this person being a member of our church at all? Is this someone in such high social standing there in Corinth that we can't say anything about his immoral behavior because he's one of us and he's bringing us some street cred. In some ways, this was the challenge when Emperor Constantine became a Christian. And theologically, he was going to lead the church in some wrong directions, but it's he's going to give us some political power. So we're not going to, who are we to second guess the emperor? Now, we don't know who the guilty party is, but this person that was guilty of some kind of immorality with his father's wife, his stepmother, you, for whatever puffed up, prideful reason, you haven't mourned about this, and you haven't disciplined this wayward member. Are you the grandpa when this person needs a father who's going to come down and explain what you've done wrong and discipline the wayward child? It's interesting because, like I said, if location of Corinth is going to lead to some immorality, let's expand the issue. This is the one man who's guilty of whoever it is. But the bigger issue of immorality at all, Corinth actually had by then become synonymous with those kinds of sins. Again, it's like Vegas, Sin City. I actually had a colleague whose son was called, and when he got his patriarchal blessing as a teenager, he was, in the blessing, it talked about his mission, and he was told, you will be called to serve among a godless people. And my colleague was like, whoa, I can't wait till this kid gets his mission call. I want to know who God considers godless. He told me, but I'm not going to say to you. Okay? Whew. But there's some place on earth that, according to this patriarch, by revelation, it's like, prepare yourself. You're going to a rough spot. Well, Paul had gone to that rough spot, namely Corinth, where in some ways they were a godless people. The word, well, I'll put it this way, a Corinthian woman had become kind of common slang in the Mediterranean for a prostitute. Who's that? That's a prostitute? Oh, is she a Corinthian woman? Wow, synonymous with that sin? Corinth had a temple to Aphrodite, Venus as we would call it, the goddess of love. And so here's a whole city that's dedicated to that and can hide its immoralities behind the guise of some kind of religious practice. Oh, we're just worshiping Venus over here. It's Aphrodite's temple, after all. Oh, careful with that. Speaking of slang, to play the Corinthian or to Corinthianize became the lingo for being immoral or playing the part of a prostitute. When your noun becomes a verb, you know you got it. You're famous for something. If Vegas became a verb, oh, that person was out. He was out Vegasing last night. What does that mean? Well, to Corinthianize, that's the issue. And again, you worry, is that just the social situation they find themselves? Oh, those are the non-members out there. Well, yeah, but if you're in the same city and you're starting to, and those kinds of sins are being normalized all around you, does that seep into your own understanding of things? Sadly, do we get to a point where, well, it's not as bad as what the world does? Well, that's not saying much. Or, well, everybody's doing it. Oh, well, that's saying a lot. And just because everyone's doing it does not justify you doing it as well. God has called us out of the world. He's asking us to be saints. He's trying to sanctify us. We saw all that at the very opening lines of this letter. But now, as he's talking about the sin that has become synonymous with Corinth, immorality, unchastity, we've got to be better than that. You can't be lifted up in pride because that justifies people in their iniquity. No, you should have mourned. And pause, preview of coming attractions. When we get to 2 Corinthians, Paul will have a whole discourse on godly sorrow. Because what he's going to say in this chapter and some of the others, it worked. They weren't mourning, but after this letter, they read it and whoa, they started to mourn. They weren't shamed, but they were pricked and felt guilt, finally. Enough to realize, what were we thinking? We were justifying ourselves either on some kind of cheap grace or out of deference to this high and mighty ruler who is among us, or for whatever reason, we didn't realize the significance and severity of our sins. I've had conversations with college kids, institute students, and others who, man, I feel for them. In some ways, they don't understand the severity of sexual sin because they're growing up in Corinth. And they're living in a world that is so hypersexualized, where it's so normalized on TV and in movies and in music. No wonder they don't want to date each other, because there's no such thing as a dating culture anymore. It's now a hookup culture. And if the date doesn't end in some kind of act of immorality, then it didn't count. It didn't mean anything. And no wonder good kids in the church don't want to date, because I don't want to end it with that. And that's what the expectation is. Even worse, what if they are willing to go on dates like that? Because if it's the expectation, and if that's what the world does, then I won't be as bad as the world, but how close can I get? I've heard things from students that have singed my eyebrows and curled up my toes, like, you don't think that? Whoa, have we really gotten to a point where the rising generation is past feeling on certain issues about morality and chastity? Do you even understand the law of chastity? Or do you just kind of sign off like, okay, yeah, as long as I don't cross a certain line, then I'm okay, but I can get as close to it as I want? Oh, be very cautious, be very careful. And chapter 5, and then into chapter 6, Paul is going to try to lay down the law in a much clearer way. I worry that we're at a point where we have to do better at that ourselves, as parents, as church leaders, as teachers. I've actually asked my students at one point, what do you call it when you learn about intimacy? And the birds and the bees, they still call it that? What else do they call it? And they're like, oh, you mean the talk? I'm like, yes, the talk. And I've said, the fact that's a singular noun instead of a plural one is a huge problem. To take something as complicated as human intimacy, that has so much writing on it for good and for ill, and to reduce it down to one single awkward conversation between two parties, neither one of which wants to be present for it? Can we just get this done? And it's okay, we had the talk, and like, good luck, son or daughter, like, behave yourself. I don't even know what we were talking about, but they're relieved the talk's over. No, we have to normalize the talk so we can have many talks and help people understand the beauty, but also the danger that comes in something as eternally significant as human intimacy. The law of chastity is huge. Missionaries, you've got to do a better job of teaching it to your investigators. Parents, we've got to do a better job of teaching it to our kids. Ignorance is not bliss in this area. So don't be puffed up and think it's all going to work out. You better mourn over these kinds of things, because this is significant sin. Now, Paul's going to pass judgment even from a distance. Verse 3 through, they won't, and they're right there in Corinth. But Paul, he's not shy about this. Verse 3 through 5, I verily, as absent in body, but present in spirit, that's where we get that idea of I'm there, I'll be there in spirit. Paul was, I have judged already, as though I were present, concerning him that hath so done this deed. Here's Paul acting as judge in absentia. He's holding court over Zoom or something. Okay, right? It's like, I've heard, I've got the letter, I know what's going on, it's been commonly reported, and so allow me, please, to pass judgment. Here it is. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. So I'm speaking on his behalf, not just on mine. When ye are gathered together, and my spirit, with the power of our Lord Jesus Christ. So get together, invoke the Spirit, have the power of God. And here's what you must do with this guilty, non-repentant sinner. Deliver such an one unto Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. Now that sounds stronger than it probably is. And rhetorically, maybe he had to be that strong to shock and awe them into some sense of recognition of what's going on. Again, he had to awaken their godly sorrow. He had to prick the conscience. In some ways, this is Peter in how bold he was in pointing the finger at his Jewish audiences early on in the book of Acts and saying, you crucified Christ. And that worked. They were pricked in their hearts and said, men and brethren, what shall we do? And they repented and made covenants to come unto Christ. Paul's hoping for similar responses here. So this is strong language. Deliver him to Satan. Let Satan destroy his flesh. It just might be that his spirit could thereby be saved in the day of the Lord. Now, don't assume this is capital punishment. Yeah, let's go destroy his flesh. Now, he's leaving that for Satan. But what, so we just pass him over to Satan? What do you mean by that? Well, in modern terms, we're talking about excommunication. The word itself is fascinating because if you're part of the family of the faithful, then you're in communion with the saints. And excommunication it's the dividing, here's the irony. The Corinthian saints are creating all these dividing lines that shouldn't exist, but then they're erasing dividing lines that should. And you're fighting over which apostle you want to follow, but you're not fighting to maintain the purity of your own community? No, the excommunication is not meant to be some kind of vengeful thing. It's meant actually to protect both parties. It's meant to protect the faithful by separating out what could end up causing major damage if the iniquity is swept under the rug and people are like know what's going on. I mean, if it's commonly reported to Paul from a distance, then everybody in town must know what's going on. And the saints of the Corinth First Ward are like, okay, behind closed doors, they're whispering things, and everybody knows the issue, but nobody wants to lift a finger to do anything about it because this person's important, and who are we? Well, Paul's calling it out. They've got to be excommunicated because if you let them stay, then everyone else at church is given this false sense of that's not that bad what he's done. And, in that case, then, I mean, there's been no discipline there. I guess I can get away with it. We're all always looking for boundaries, right? And that guy really pushed it, and they're still okay, so can I follow suit? No. Part of the purposes of church discipline is to protect the saints and the good name of the church. It's also to save the soul of the sinner. And sometimes they need a full reset. Leaving them outside the sanctuary of standards. I mean, they left it already. Okay, I guess we're going to make official what you had already done to yourself. You excommunicated yourself. You left the safety of God's standards. And the only other master that you could possibly have is Satan now. And he's after the destruction of your flesh. We're still after the salvation of your spirit. But to go out there and grapple with the reality of this is what it feels like to be on your own. This is what it feels like to really lose the spirit. You want to stay? Or do you want to take salvation and sin more seriously and repent of those sins and come back? We'd love to offer you rebaptism, recommunication after your excommunication. Okay? So keep reading and notice what Paul says in verse 6 through 8. Your glorying is not good. And that goes back to that being puffed up about what's happening here. Don't glory in this. You should feel sick over these sins. Know ye not that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? Now, Jesus used the idea of leaven in a positive light in the parable of the leaven. That, leaven leavens the whole lump. And if you can put a little faith into the mix, then everyone can grow in God. That's good. Well, this is the bad version. This is the leaven of sin, and unfortunately, it starts to spread too. This is like mold spreading throughout the dough. This is cancer spreading throughout the body. So there's no other alternative than to cut out the cancerous part. Excommunication, it's our only hope to save the rest. So the way he puts it here, purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. And then, probably Paul thinking of his old Pharisee days, his Jewish background, knowing there's Jewish Christians in his audience. What are we all thinking when it comes to clearing out the old leaven? Well, this is the feast of unleavened bread that goes along with the Passover. So along those lines, Paul says, for even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. You remember the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover was spring cleaning in the Jewish world. Let's clear out every last crumb. Anything that has yeast, leaven in it, because that will lead to decay. Any last vestige of sin must be swept out of our souls, all through Christ, our Passover. He's the Lamb without blemish. It's his blood on our doorposts. He's the one. It's the death of the firstborn that allows those in bondage to go free. Such powerful imagery around that Passover. Back to the issue at hand, though. Verse 9. I wrote unto you in an epistle. And that should stop us. Wait. You already wrote something? I thought this was 1 Corinthians. Well, we'll see it again in 2 Corinthians that there may have been more than just 2 letters. And some scholars have even suggested maybe this first letter was actually compiled later out of smaller letters that had gone before. So is this already a second part? And what we've studied to this point, was this a 1 Corinthians? Hard to tell. But here he is saying, I've already written you about this. And what did I tell you in that earlier epistle? Not to company with fornicators. Now, you can take this too far, and he cautions them against that in the next line. Yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or with idolaters. For then must ye needs go out of the world. What he's saying there, it's like, now when I said don't hang around with sinners, because it's not just the fornicators, it's everybody else that he named. When I said don't hang out with sinners, I didn't mean like any sinner anywhere, because where are you going to go to get out of their presence? I mean, you're going to leave the planet? I mean, it's a natural man, and they're natural all over the place. For that, you must needs go out of the world. So it's not all together. I'm just talking about people there at church. Fellow covenant makers. When they become covenant breakers, are you still hanging out? Are you allowing their leaven to leaven your lump? Be careful here. So he says, now I have written unto you not to keep company. If any man that is called a brother, so they're in the faith, if a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, Paul did love his lists of sins, right? With such an one, no, not to eat. And eating, think about that with Passover. Think about with feasts of unleavened bread. Think about that with communion meals and the need for an excommunication. They're breaking covenants. And to allow them to continue to participate in the sacraments is doing a disservice to the Lamb of God whose blood and body we are partaking of together. Remember when Jesus was there in 3rd Nephi, avoiding disputations among the people. One of the things that he had to solve, one of the problems he had to fix, was their disputation over church discipline. And you can picture people, some erring on the side of justice and others on the side of mercy, and some saying, oh, but the person matters most, and so the worth of souls. And the other saying, but the sacraments must be kept sacred, and the Lord did an incredible job of proving the contraries and trying to strike a better balance. Here, the same will be expected of the Corinthian saints. Yes, honor the worth of souls. But whose soul are we talking about? Are we talking about long-term or short-term? I still value the soul of the sinner. That's why we got to wake him up to his own iniquity. But I also value the souls of the other saints that are being ill-affected by this person who is normalizing sin around everyone else. And as for the other side, we have to guard the sanctity of the sacraments, because Christ is our Passover. And so no, do not partake of the sacrament unworthily, or you're drinking damnation to your own soul. For which he says in verse 12 and 13, for what have I to do to judge them also that are without? I'm not worried about them. I'm sure there'll be fornicators at work, and I'm not passing judgment on them. They haven't promised to do otherwise. But at church, that's a different matter. So he says, do not ye judge them that are within, but them that are without God judgeth. Leave that in his hands. But we have things in our hands we've got to take care of. Therefore, put away from among yourselves that wicked person. And with that, he ends the chapter. I mean, that's the judge. He hits the gavel and says, that's where we are, and that's where we got to leave things. This man must be excommunicated. I don't care what position he held in society. He cannot be held in esteem among the saints until he repents of his sins. Again, are you starting to sense why in 2 Corinthians they will have felt some godly sorrow? Like, we really blew that, didn't we? Sin had been so normalized that we were succumbing to it ourselves. And that's got to change. He'll say more of that in chapter 6. And this is another strong chapter that's going to invoke some of the godly sorrow that the Corinthian saints are missing to this point. Verse 1, dare any of you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unjust, and not before the saints? Come on, do ye not know that the saints shall judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are ye unworthy to judge the smallest matters? Know ye not that ye shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? If then ye have judgments of things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are least esteemed in the church. Now, long passage there, but to understand what he's saying, he just talked about passing judgment upon this wicked fornicator, this unchaste man. Now he's expanding it into judgment in general. And what he's shocked by is, how dare you? That's the beginning. Dare any of you. How dare you go to law against each other out in the world before the unjust? It's like, can't you handle these things yourselves? The problem that he's seeing here, again, probably commonly reported among them, is that church members are suing fellow church members. And they're going to a Corinthian court to determine, this is like Judge Judy, or whatever it is, the people's court. We're going to go there, and they're going to solve our problems. And Paul is like, seriously? You can't solve your own problems? First of all, what is that? What are we saying to those on the outside? Oh, these so-called Christians can't even solve their own problems. Some Christians they turned out to be. This one did this unchristian thing to the other one, and now this one's mad and back, and no wonder there's division and disputation and contention and now litigation. Man, these people are so happy. Oh, that's a scary place to be. Again, back to location. I wonder if this is more of an economic thing. If we're so focused on materialism and greed and pride and who's above one another, being puffed up, that's often what we sue people over. They cheated me, they defrauded me, and they're the guilty one, and I deserve this. But among fellow saints, the way he says it over and over here, you're supposed to be the judges of the world. Why do you have to go to the world to let them pass judgment on you? Come on. Or when he says, you're supposed to be judging heavenly things, and you can't even judge things that pertain to this life. Come on. The way he says it at the end there, they'll set them to judge who are least esteemed in the church. Let's take the most humble among you. They'll probably be able to work things out. They'll probably be able to pass judgment because they're so humble. How dare you be prideful in their presence? I had a state president that way in Tennessee who was so humble. I told him once, I said, you're like the black hole of pride. He's like, what do you mean? I said, you're just so humble. Nobody can be prideful around you. They don't have a leg to stand on. You just suck it right out of them. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It's amazing. I don't know how you do it. But take the least esteemed in the church, even the least among the saints, would hopefully be Christian enough to be able to solve problems between Christians. Don't go to some outside court in Corinth. That's making us all look bad. So he then says in verse 5 through 8, I speak to your shame. Now, no, he's not trying to publicly shame them. He's not creating a shame culture. No, he's appealing to their conscience. It's as if we would say it, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. I'm not trying to shame you. You should feel the shame. Can you not solve interpersonal problems in the Lord's way? No, you got to go do it some legal battle. He says, is it so that there is not a wise man among you? In other words, is there really nobody who can handle this? No one who can set you two to right in the Lord's way? No, not one that shall be able to judge between his brethren. And ooh, that word hurts. We're supposed to be our brother's keepers, not taking our brethren to court. He keeps hitting that word. But brother goeth to law with brother, and that before the unbelievers. Again, what kind of impression will that give them of us? Now therefore, there is utterly a fault among you, because ye go to law one with another. Why do ye not rather take wrong? Why do ye not rather suffer yourselves to be defrauded? Nay, ye do wrong and defraud, and that your brethren. If you're going to go sue a brother or a sister, instead of working things out in the Lord's way, gentleness, meekness, love unfeigned, then honestly, like he says at the end, it would have been better for you to just take it and turn the other cheek, rather than sue somebody. If you can't work it out and help the other person apply justice so that you receive some mercy, if you can't solve things in-house, and somebody that's humble enough to suck the pride out of the two of you, and can we come together on this? There's such a great story in early church history where there was these two farmers fighting over, I can't remember if it was water rights or like land dispute, where the fence goes in the middle, something like that. They were at odds. They were probably close to suing each other. In some Gentile court, oh, God forbid. So they both agreed, let's go to President John Taylor. And whatever he decides, will you agree with what he says? Because I'm sure he's going to side with me. And the other said, oh yeah, because I'm sure he's going to side with me. But they both agreed to allow, let's keep it in-house, and we'll let the prophet pass judgment. Well, they went, and I love this story, because John Taylor, who had an incredible voice, he's the one that sang A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief in Carthage jail, right before the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram. As these two brothers came there in his office, and he heard some of the story and sensed the anger between them. Well, how's this for solving problems in the Lord's way? He said, brethren, I appreciate you coming to see me on this. I recognize that there's a lot of feeling here. Do you mind if, it probably sounds strange to open court with an opening hymn, but do you mind if I sing a hymn? And they're like, okay. A chance to have a private concert with the prophet, be my guest. And he sang a hymn. After which he said, I can never sing only one hymn. They always at least have to have two. Maybe, again, that's why he sang it twice in Carthage. But he sang he's like, do you mind if I sing a second hymn? And they're like, you outrank us. Be my guest. He sang a second hymn. After which, still no change in their demeanor. And so he said, I'm sorry, I'm really not trying to postpone our court case. But would you allow me to sing another song? I don't know what songs he chose, but the hymns of Zion invite the Spirit, and that third one finally was enough to invite the Spirit into hardened hearts, that thereby softened. And by the end of the song, these two men stood up and embraced each other and treated each other like brethren, like Christians, and apologized for taking President Taylor's time, and left with the spiritual ability to solve their own problems between them. Can we do better at that? Can we be Christians to one another instead of taking each other to court? Again, I love the way Paul ended that last verse. If you can't, then just take it on the chin. If you both can't be the big person, then be big enough to be small and just let it go. In verse 9 through 11, he then says, know ye not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? And that's how you're behaving lately. Oh no, be not deceived. Neither fornicators, there's the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers. Interesting, he put those two together. Remember how often we saw those associated in the Old Testament? Idolatry and adultery, the covenant infidelity, cheating on your spouse or cheating on your God, either way, same problem. Now he keeps going on with his lists that he was so famous for. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, the next two are tricky, nor effeminate, and that doesn't just mean anyone who's more female. The contemporary English version translates that as a pervert, and that's pretty broad, but it might be more specific than that. effeminate might refer to a catamite, which in the ancient world was a young boy groomed for homosexual practices. I should have given you an alert here. There's some strong language that Paul is going to use. And unfortunately, among ancient Greek philosophers and Roman senators and leaders and so on, that was a fairly common practice. Again, if Corinth becomes synonymous with sin, then these are things that are going on, and to groom some young man to engage with an adult man in homosexual behaviors, that might be what he's describing here as an effeminate. Next he says, nor abusers of themselves with mankind. And that probably is suggesting other forms of homosexual behavior. And again, it's behavior that he's condemning, not temptation. It hasn't yet become sin because it hasn't been acted out. But in this case, it has been. Okay? So beware of that. And then he adds some others, more common, that we're more familiar with. Nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners. None of those shall inherit the kingdom of God. And then how's this for pointing the finger? And such were some of you. But ye are washed, but ye are sanctified, but ye are justified in the name of the Lord Jesus and by the Spirit of our God. A strong ending. But notice the verb tense. Along that long list, I'm sure it pricked a few consciences even just to hear those words again, because that describes what some of you were. But don't worry, it no longer describes what you are. It's what you've done, but it's not what you're doing. It's certainly not who you're becoming. Because who are you becoming? You've been washed and justified and sanctified. You're allowing the Lord to transform you, instead of allowing the world to conform you to its wickedness. So you've changed. So can that man guilty of fornication. So can anyone else there in the Corinthian first ward that is struggling with sin. You can change. Please do. He says in verse 12, all things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Now that's confusing because it sounds like Paul is saying, hey, I could get away with any, but that doesn't mean I should. The JST actually corrects that and inserts a not right where it should be. All things are not lawful unto me. So of course they're not expedient. And I'm not justified in committing these kinds of sins. Now that's one way to solve the problem of that verse. But another actually is based in the Greek, because in other translations, again basing their translation in the Greek original, Paul isn't expressing his own feelings there. Instead, he's quoting them. It's like he's saying, you guys think you can do anything you want. You think everything's lawful. Well, it isn't. It's not even expedient. You people think that, hey, it's lawful for me, and I'm not going to let anybody tell me otherwise. I'm not going to be under anybody else's power. I have my own agency. You can't tell me what to do. Oh, careful, careful. The next line is also in their words. They say, meats for the belly, and the belly for meats. As if to say, hey, I've got these physical appetites, that's the belly, and these physical pleasures out there. There's the meats. They sure seem made for each other, huh? And wouldn't that be true of not just the physical appetite toward food, but what about the physical appetite toward immorality, for example? I mean, the appetite and the pleasure go hand in hand. It seems like a match made in heaven. Well, it is in the Lord's way. But outside the bounds he has set, that's a match made in hell. So Paul warns them, God shall destroy both it and them, since that's not what the body was designed for. The belly was not meant for that meat. You've got to start with other milk, and then you'll be ready for the true meat that God has prepared for you. As Paul puts it bluntly, now the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God hath both raised up the Lord, and will also raise up us by his own power. Amazing what he does right at the end there. He's been talking about chastity, immorality, and the body, and the part the body plays in those immoral acts. And then it feels like he swings the pendulum, or not swings the pendulum, but turns the wheel sharply, and he ends by talking about the resurrection? Why'd you do that? Well, think about it. I've been talking about the body. And that's not what the body was designed for. The body was designed for eternity. It will be resurrected. Christ was raised. You will be too. In some ways, I think Paul is saying one of the best arguments for morality I can give you is the doctrine of the resurrection. Because so many sins of immorality are using the body for things it wasn't designed for. And if the body is meant for glory, in fact, think of it this way. We will be resurrected either to a telestial or a terrestrial or a celestial degree of glory based on the degree of law that we keep. And what's amazing about immorality, that is a telestial use of the body. Sins of commission. Whereas eternal increase is only available in the highest degree of the celestial kingdom. So for you to be resurrected to that glory with that kind of body, you will have had to learn to master the body in this life in terms of morality, chastity, procreation. The only place where procreation will be permitted in the eternities is among those who have been resurrected to a celestial glory. They've learned to master the flesh. They are then permitted to return to glorified flesh and bone. Interesting. I think it's also interesting to realize why Satan tries so hard to push immoral sins. Because in some ways it's a weapon that can hit all of his preferred targets. How's this for a list? I was brainstorming. Satan hates the family because the family is central to the Creator's plan. It's the laboratory where we become true Christians. Satan can't stand it. Another thing he can't stand is the body itself because he never got one. Okay, right? You think about Legion and the Gadarene swine. Satan hates our body. We have something he doesn't. He hates agency. Speaking of something that we have. He didn't want us to have it in premortality, right? And the irony now is that's the only thing he can use against us. That's got to frustrate him to no end. He also hates spiritual strength over physical appetite. He'd much rather that we just succumb to physical appetite. That's why he was pushing that first temptation in Jesus' face. Change the stones to bread. The fact Jesus could say no when the spirit was willing, despite the fact that the flesh was weak, but the spirit still overcame, that frustrated the adversary. Still does. Satan also hates patience, since he doesn't have any of it. Everything he wanted, everything he demanded in the war in heaven could have been his if he'd followed the Father's plan. He just couldn't wait for it and do it in the right way. And Satan really hates the thought of one of God's spirit children coming to earth with a head start, having been born within the covenant, which means it's just a matter of time that they'll make that covenant themselves. Hate that. Now think about immorality as a weapon that Satan can use for all of his favorite targets. Immorality will tear the family apart. Immorality is a sin against the body. It's using the body against itself. Immorality is a misuse, an abuse of agency. And since so many sins become addictive, and sexual sin, it can be included there, it can be a complete abdication of agency, a loss of it. What else does immorality do? It's the ultimate example of the physical appetite overcoming the spirit instead of vice versa. So of course he's going to push that our way. Patience, immorality is the ultimate example of impatience. You could have that in the right way, but no, I want it right now in the wrong way. And allowing people to come to earth within the covenant, no, immorality brings people to the earth ill-prepared. You understand what I'm trying to describe here? Chastity is such a blessing, and immorality is such a curse, a self-inflicted one. No wonder in verse 15, Paul will return to something he'd said back in chapter 3, but intensify the analogy, because he's got a stronger point to make here. Verse 15, know ye not that your bodies are the members of Christ? In other words, the body parts of Christ. That's amazing. Your bodies are Christ's body parts. We belong to him. We belong to each other. It's his atonement that runs through us all like blood throughout the body of Christ. So think about that. Your immorality really does affect others. I mean, we try to fool ourselves into thinking it doesn't. Like, oh, no, this is just me. It's behind closed doors. It's not hurting anybody. Oh, it is, because we are all members of one another. Our bodies are the members of Christ. So Paul asks the pointed question, shall I then take the members of Christ and make them the members of an harlot? Ooh, God forbid. And yeah, he does forbid it, literally. But here rhetorically, God forbid, he's using strong language here. Why would we're supposed to join each other in the right way because we're body parts of the body of Christ. And yet to commit fornication, adultery, any other kind of sexual sin, we're joining ourselves to a prostitute. Or I could put it this way, we are prostituting our true purpose. We're using our body for something it was not designed for. We're playing outside of bounds. And to join ourselves in that kind of way, we're prostituting Christ himself. Because we're supposed to belong to him. The thought of cheating on Jesus hopefully will shock us into true fidelity to him. So what else does he say? What? It's almost like he's pausing he knows that he's shock and awe them. It's like, what, you're going to go prostitute things? You're going to be a harlot? Well, God forbid. And they're like, whoa. And he's like, what? You think I'm talking too strong? He says, know ye not that he which is joined to an harlot is one body? For two, saith he, shall be one flesh. He's invoking Genesis there, where two, man and woman, Adam and Eve, are supposed to become one flesh. Well, to do that with an harlot, compare that to what God is asking of us. He that is joined unto the Lord is one spirit. That's the kind of relationship the Lord is seeking with us. Oneness. That's what the at-one-ment is for. These are meant to be the most loyal, the most close, the most intimate relationships imaginable. But those are covenant relationships. It's becoming one with Christ, not one with the world. Certainly not one with an harlot. Do not prostitute your divine purpose. Allow the Spirit to conquer the flesh, not vice versa. So the advice he gives in verse 18, in two single words, flee fornication. I can't think of a better verb, by the way. We sometimes talk about fight or flight. Well, Paul is suggesting don't fight the temptation of sexual sin. Flee from it instead. Fight or flight, opt with flight. Don't stand around and try to rationalize and justify, because the longer you talk, the longer the adversary can wear down your defenses. Think about Balaam with the talking donkey last year in the book of Numbers. When Balak sends his messengers and says, hey, come with us and go back and curse the people of Israel. And Balaam is like, oh, I can't do that. But maybe I'll join you on the journey back just in case God changes his mind on the way. Oh, that's not fleeing fornication. That's not running away from the possibility of sin. Think about Jesus in that first temptation on the mount. Change the stones to bread. There's physical appetite. Come on, meat for the belly and belly for meat. You're made for this. You're supposed to eat. And the Lord's like, not this way. But he doesn't stand there and extend the argument. He leaves. He flees. In fact, where does the second temptation take place? In other words, where did Jesus go to get away from Satan's physical temptation? He went to the temple. That should tell us something. He fled to a holy place. Get out of Babylon, run to Zion. And that's what Paul is suggesting. But maybe the poster boy for this would be Joseph of Egypt. Because what did he do when Potiphar's wife came a-calling? In fact, came and grabbed him by the garment. He didn't stand around and argue. He didn't try to talk her out of it. No, he left the garment in her hand and got him out. According to Elder Maxwell, It not only showed good morals, it showed good legs. And maybe that's what we need when these kinds of temptations come calling. Good legs. Just run. Walk out of the movie. Leave the party. End the date. Turn the channel. Delete the app. Change your thought patterns. Flee. Run. Get out. And allow the Lord to keep you safe somewhere else within the sanctuary of standards. Please, Paul begs of them, flee fornication. For every sin that a man doeth is without the body. At least most of them are. When we rob, when we kill, they're horrible things, but they're outside us. But he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. Think about that. It's bad enough to rob someone else. Why would you steal from yourself? It's bad enough to damage someone else, but to self-inflict some kind of damage? That's what immorality is. What? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own? For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. And that's apostrophe S. That's possessive. You belong to Him, not to yourself. No, it's not my body, my choice. It's not, I can do whatever I want. No, you've been purchased. And Christ, our Passover, has paid the purchase price. Speaking of what you do with a body, Christ sacrificed His in order to redeem ours. We owe Him some allegiance for that. Like I said, back in chapter 3, he used the same idea about your body being a temple. But back then it was focused on construction. Here, it's focused on sanctification. And we'll think about every temple we build. And somewhere on the exterior, etched into stone, actually often etched into gold, holiness to the Lord. Is that etched into the fleshy tables of our heart? Are we that focused to be holy and clean and pure and chaste and moral and virtuous and Christ-like? Will we develop sufficient self-control? That is what the Lord is asking. In fact, it's what the Lord is commanding. Take it all together, and why must we keep our bodies so sacred? And this is chastity, this is word of wisdom, this is eating disorders, this is exercise and nutrition, this is everything having to do with the mortal tabernacle that houses our spirit. Think about the 4 things he's already told us from chapter 3 and chapter 6. From 3:16, because the Spirit dwells in you. From 3:17, because the body is holy. In 6:19, because the body is a gift from God Himself. And from 6:20, because you've been bought with a price. So don't cheapen the price that Jesus paid to redeem you. I think it would be wise for each of us to ponder more personally how we're treating our bodies, what we're doing with them and to them. And I imagine that the Holy Ghost will help every one of us find some room for improvement. Now, when it comes to some of the most drastic improvement required, it's going from fornication to faithfulness. It's going from immorality to true morality. And to emphasize this, would you allow me to just share 2 quotes? One from Elder Holland and one from Elder Lewis. Well, C.S. Lewis. He's as close to an elder as you can make it. Okay. The first one from Elder Holland comes from a talk made famous when he was president of BYU. It was called Of Souls, Symbols, and Sacraments. And it's a doozy. It's a masterpiece. Perhaps the greatest talk on chastity given in this dispensation, if I can give him that praise. He described chastity as a matter of soul, because your body with your spirit is your soul. So it's soul we're talking about. It's not just body to body. It's soul to soul that you're messing with when you're unchaste. Soul symbols This union of husband and wife, of man and woman, is symbolic of the kind of union that is meant to take place between us and God. There is an intimacy and at-one-ment between humanity and divinity through the atonement of Christ. And sacraments, yeah, let's raise it to that level. Intimacy as a sacramental act that must not be sullied. It must be kept sacred. It's powerful talk. He gave a version of that talk years later when he was an apostle. It was meant for more than just BYU students. It was meant for the world. I actually remember this one well because he gave it in October of 1998. I didn't even have to look that up because I was married in February of 1999. So this was the last conference before I was married. I had just gotten engaged. And my wife and I were both very grateful for such a crystal clear, clarion call from an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. A Paul there at the end of the 20th century, speaking to us as a father, no mere instructor, and not softening things, but being very clear. Can I just share 2 paragraphs from what he said? 2 of my favorite. And in honor of the passing of Sister Holland so recently, and in honor of Elder Holland, who is struggling with his own health currently, this amazing dynamic duo, the Jeff and Pat show, as it used to be called when they would speak in tandem at BYU. Oh, this amazing couple who love each other and are true to each other. Well, based on their example, these words ring so true. Elder Holland said, "Such a total, virtually unbreakable union, such an unyielding commitment between a man and a woman can only come with the proximity and permanence afforded in a marriage covenant, with a union of all that they possess, their very hearts and minds, all their days and all their dreams." And I was so close to beginning those days and fulfilling those dreams with my own wife. The way Elder Holland described the next is what my wife and I just wanted to be able to participate in. He said, they work together, they cry together, they enjoy Brahms and Beethoven and breakfasts together. They sacrifice and save and live together for all the abundance that such a totally intimate life provides such a couple. And the external symbol of that union, the physical manifestation of what is a far deeper spiritual and metaphysical bonding, is the physical blending that is part of, indeed a most beautiful and gratifying expression of, that larger, more complete union of eternal purpose and promise. As all couples come to that moment of bonding in mortality, Elder Holland said, it is intended to be just such a complete union. That commandment cannot be fulfilled, and that symbolism of one flesh cannot be preserved if we hastily and guiltily and surreptitiously share intimacy in a darkened corner of a darkened hour, then just as hastily and guiltily and surreptitiously retreat to our separate worlds, not to eat or live or cry or laugh together, not to do the laundry and the dishes and the homework, not to manage a budget and to pay the bills and tend the children and plan together for the future. No, we cannot do that until we are truly one, united, bound, linked, tied, welded, sealed, married. Thank you, Elder and Sister Holland, for embodying that kind of commitment through a lifetime here in mortality. No wonder you deserve the promise of an eternity of that beyond. Honestly, I remember friends back in the old high school football days boasting of their sexual escapades and telling me, Halverson, you don't know what you're missing. And they were right. I didn't. But based on the full union Elder Holland is describing here, that goes so far beyond the mere union of body and body, I can honestly think back to those old high school friends and say to them, lamenting, you don't know what you're missing. You settled for a part when the Lord offers us the whole. Honestly, I consider it a tragedy that we have ceded talk of sexuality to a wicked world. A hypersexualized world where Hollywood talks about it all the time. It is not shy about it. It shoves it in our face constantly. But that's in a way that the Spirit can have nothing to do with. And so unfortunately, youth and young adults grow up with the world's view of it, and it starts to feel icky, to use that kind of term. It cannot be confirmed as a beautiful thing. It's wrong. And unfortunately, it ruins it for people even when it becomes right. And that's tragic. We allow our youth and young adults to grow up missing out on the kinds of celestial conversations we can have with covenant parents who carefully and sensitively, with milk and meat, can help their children prepare for the beauty of shared marital intimacy. No, we're too shy to talk about it, and the world is not shy about it at all. So our youth and young adults only know the wicked form and are disgusted by it and haven't been prepared for the beauty of this within the bounds the Lord has set. Again, thank you, Elder Holland, for your cautions and your confirmations of what to beware of and what beauty to prepare for. The other quote comes from C.S. Lewis, and it's shorter and simpler, but it provides a visual image that I think is incredibly powerful. He says, the monstrosity of sexual intercourse outside marriage, and that's a strong word, monstrosity. What's so monstrous about it is that those who indulge in it are trying to isolate one kind of union, the sexual, from all the other kinds of union which were intended to go along with it and make up the total union. That's what Elder Holland was getting at too. But then how's this for a visual aid? The Christian attitude does not mean that there is anything wrong about sexual pleasure, any more than about the pleasure of eating. It means that you must not isolate that pleasure and try to get it by itself, any more than you ought to try to get the pleasures of taste without swallowing and digesting. And how do you do that? Well, by chewing things and spitting them out again. Talk about a major mess of pottage that you're selling your soul for, just to eat it and then spit it out again. Thanks for the visual aid, Elder Lewis. Now, Paul is going to step away from the strong language of sexual immorality that we saw in chapter 5 and in chapter 6. But in chapter 7, he's going to maintain his focus on marriage. Let's talk about that. And he's going to expand it. This is the longest chapter we have to study today, but we're going to go through it fairly quickly because what he's describing here is marriage, its pros and cons. And you're like, what, but cons? Well, in certain circumstances. And it's those circumstances that Paul is going to focus on. Take a look at the chapter heading here, and it's going to help us prepare for what we're going to see in this chapter, because it's easy to lose sight of that and start misunderstanding Paul. But what we're seeing in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is a message about marriage to those in the ministry. Okay, keep that in mind, the full-time ministry. And some of what he speaks of in this chapter doesn't apply across the board in all circumstances. It's focused on those in that circumstance. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Chapter 7, verse 1. Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me. So yeah, the letters have been going back and forth, and this is a question that they had. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Now, what's confusing about that is it makes it sound like Paul's advice from the very start is to avoid intimacy in general. I mean, that's what he said, right? It is good for a man not to touch a woman. Well, actually, no, that's not what he said. The JST clarifies this, and actually the original Greek makes this obvious, because in its own way, it's like it's attaching quotation marks and saying, this is not what Paul is saying, this is what they were asking Paul about in their letter. So the JST actually gets us back closer to the original Greek. The way we would read it is, ye wrote unto me saying, so here's the quotation marks, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. I mean, right? Isn't that what you're saying? We should all be celibate, lifelong. We shouldn't touch a woman, and touch is in the intimate way. Well, nevertheless, I say, so now here's Paul responding to their question about permanent celibacy. Avoid fornication. So that's first and foremost. You got to get rid of that. Go back and reread chapter 5 and chapter 6. Okay, your body's a temple. Keep it that way. So as long as you're avoiding fornication, that's the first thing. But beyond that, is marriage a problem? No. As he said here, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife. Let every woman have her own husband. Marriage is a great way to avoid fornication. But I'd also want to pause here and caution, is that an automatic solution for it? Is marriage a get-out-of-jail card? When I was in a bishopric as a young newlywed myself, in a married student ward at BYU, surrounded by other fellow newlyweds, our bishop very wisely cautioned us, lust is not lost in marriage. He taught us that repeatedly. And that was an important caution, because sometimes if a couple has struggled with the temptation of sexual immorality during their engagement, for example, and then, hey, let's just get married, and then it's all on the table, and everything's legal. Well, the act is, but what about the emotion behind it? Perhaps the status of your act has changed, but if the motivation behind it has not, then it could still be sinful, even if it's not technically immoral. You understand? Lust is not lost in marriage. The solution is repentance and reliance upon the Lord. The solution is self-mastery, not just marriage. And now I can give in to that temptation anytime I want. I got free reign here. I can reign over my spouse and use them for self-satisfaction. Careful there. Okay? But what's Paul going to teach us here? How do we navigate intimacy within a marital relationship? This is a powerful chapter to help us wrestle with those questions. Verse 3 through 5, first thing to keep in mind. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. Now, due benevolence, those King James translators sure were careful not to raise any eyebrows. That's just a euphemism for what we might call marital duties, or what some people call conjugal rights. This is fulfilling the act of marriage. This is meeting one another's physical needs within the bonds of matrimony. That's due benevolence. But did you see how Paul phrased it? Who does he start with? Let the husband render unto his wife due benevolence. I'm amazed that Paul puts the woman's needs before the man's needs, which is the opposite of what the world has been doing ever since. In the world's way of seeing things, it's the man's needs that must trump all other things. In fact, do women have needs along those lines at all? No, not at all. No, he's honoring the fact that the female has a part to play here, and she has feelings and needs and expectations and so on. And he's putting her before the male. Then he quickly responds with the male version as well. It's going to go both directions. It has to. He's going to be very careful to prove the contrary of male and female, husband and wife. But I do love the fact that he puts her first. And this idea of being willing to render unto one another that due benevolence actually exalts intimacy within a marriage. It's saying this is something this is within the bounds the Lord has set. So, yes, lust is not lost in marriage, and you should have righteous desires, but this desire is a righteous one when it's meant to be benevolent, when it's meant to bless one another. There's something beautiful about this kind of marital love. And then Paul seems to even intensify it in the next verse. He says, the wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. He's the one that has power over her. But don't stop there, or you're in big trouble. And likewise, also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. And that's amazing. It's like both people should honor one another's needs, but also both people have control over the opposite person in the partnership. It's one thing to say you have control over yourself. So yeah, self-control. But to control the other person? Wait a minute. Well, isn't that what you said when you self-sacrificed? We get married at altars. And what do you put on altars? Yourself. Something you're going to offer up. And I'm laying myself at that altar, giving myself to my spouse. Meanwhile, she's giving herself to me. But what's amazing about that is, wait, if I have control over her, but she has control over me, then we both have veto power over one another. Can you imagine in a car letting the person, we always talk about driver and passenger. What if they were dual drivers in the front seats? And you had the gas pedal on one side and the brake on the other. Ooh, and they can like offset each other. Or another way to put it is put the steering wheel on one side and put both pedals on the other. You're not going anywhere until you come to an agreement. And that needs to describe the intimacy within a covenant marriage. Here, I want to be sensitive here. I want to be careful. But according to stereotypes, and those are typically based in some form of reality, men and women tend to be wired differently toward intimacy. And that's why I talk about the difference between the gas pedal and the brake. And if you were to put those on two sides of the car, in a marriage, can you imagine if you got to control the other person's pedal, but they get to control yours? You get to decide whether your spouse moves forward or moves back, but they get to decide the same for you. There's going to be a need for communication and compromise and kindness and compassion. There will be times in that compromise where one person says no even though they want to say yes. And times where the other person says yes even when they want to say no. This is hard. This is one of the best examples of proving a contrary in a very significant part of married life. It's one that many couples struggle with. It's a cause for divorce among many of them. They can't get on the same page intimately. But the fact that God would require that we become one emotionally and mentally and spiritually before we can become one physically, that seems fitting. That seems right, that there's going to be a level of self-sacrifice on both parts. That we're going to try to honor one another's needs, whether that's a need to be together in that way or a need to stay apart in that way. And as long as one person doesn't get to always trump the other person, whether that's trump them with a yes or trump them with a no, when one person gets the rule supreme over the other person's body and the vice versa doesn't take place, and again, this is not a matter of taking turns not compromising. Okay, no, you got your way last time, I get my way this time. That's not compromise. That's, I'm only mad half the time, but you're mad the other half the time, so somebody's mad all the time. That's not a good marriage. It's trying to meet one another's needs in a way that will honor each other and where they're coming from. I mean, the way that Paul says it in the next verse, strong language. He says, defraud ye not one the other. And by defraud, other translations say deprive. Same idea, it's this taking away what rightfully belongs to another. But to consider it like fraud, don't defraud each other, don't deprive each other. Or the JST, don't depart from one another. Depart ye not one from the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye might give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. And that word just means lack of restraint or self-control. Interesting passage. It's this idea, on the one hand, intimacy must be consensual, but abstinence must be consensual too. Remember, we both have control over the other person's body. And so not defrauding, not depriving, not departing, except it's consent, both of you. And it's for a time, because you have other things that need to be done. In this case, it's fasting and prayer, and I want to focus on that. I'm fasting from any physical appetite, not just food. Okay. Or maybe it's, I'm trying to recover after childbirth, Or I'm just going through a lot of hard things, and we need to honor that. We need to honor the separation, but we also need to honor the need to return to one another and reunite. These are really important principles to follow. Elder Packer once said something about marriage that I think equally applies to intimacy within marriage. Elder Packer once joked and said, the miracle in marriage is not that two people fall in love. It's that two people love each other the same amount at the same time. That's the miracle. I mean, sometimes one likes the other and the other hasn't quite gotten there, and then the other one person comes around, but then by then the other person's given up hope. No, it's the same amount of love in the same moment. Oh, now you're ready to get married. Thank you, Elder Packer. Taking that principle and applying it to the act of marriage, you need to love each other the same amount at the same time. Or at least close enough that one is willing to make the compromise, whether it's yes or no, whether it's intimacy or abstinence, consensual either way. Okay? Then, verse 6 through 9, but I speak this by permission and not of commandment. Other translations say this is a concession, not a commandment. I'm allowing for that kind of intimacy. But as far as what I would prefer, next line, I would that all men were even as I myself. And what he means by I myself, well, what is Paul at that time? He is celibate. And that's what he would prefer for everyone. But, he admits, every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, or JST, if they cannot abide, then fine, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Ooh, strong language. It's pretty famous. Or the JST, which softens it. It is better to marry than that any should commit sin. So that goes back to what Paul had said earlier, flee fornication. Base level, no matter what you do, marriage or not marriage, you got to overcome lust. You've got to avoid immorality. Okay? We at least on the basis of the law of chastity? Good. Now we have a question about marriage itself or celibacy, which is preferable. And as far as Paul is concerned here, well, for me, I'd say stay celibate. Now, this is where it gets tricky because Catholicism, for example, that prioritizes celibacy, a celibate priesthood, the orders, of nuns and monks and priests and so on, no marriage, no intimacy at all. And that's the higher sacrament in Catholicism. They've allowed marriage as a secondary sacrament. You're kind of a second-class citizen, so to speak, but at least it's better to marry than to burn. Whether it's burn with lust or burn in hell if you succumb to your lust. That's kind of the sense that they give it. We would push back a little against that. Protestantism would as well, so they don't believe in a celibate priesthood. But the idea here would be, has Paul never been married? And therefore is saying you shouldn't get married either? At least that's my preference. I mean, if you can't hack it, then fine, get married. It's not a sin. It would be sin to do what you're going to do outside of marriage. So do it inside of marriage and it'll be okay. But those of us that were made of sterner stuff, we can handle a lifelong, celibate, unmarried existence. Well, be careful because it's actually more likely that Paul had been married and was simply widowed by now. If we see Paul as a widower, then this puts things in a different light, that if you're in the same circumstance and you're a widower or a widow as well, then I'm staying single. I suggest the same for you. Now, I'm not requiring it of you. This is what I would do. And after all, everybody has their own proper gift. And maybe your gift is relationships, and maybe my gift is self-control, and I don't need those kinds of things. I mean, you think about our own Quorum of the 12. When Elder Perry's wife passed away, years and years, right as he was beginning his ministry as an apostle, his initial thought was, I'm going to be the most effective apostle in history because I never have to come home from the office. There's no one to come home to. My wife has passed. I'm grateful she lived long enough to see what she'd made of me through our marriage together. But not having a companion anymore, I will marry myself to my ministry and give it all I got. And yet Elder Perry discovered in the ensuing years, it was the least productive time of his entire life. And he realized that in his situation, having a companion, equally yoked, he was able to move forward faster and stronger than he could possibly do on his own. And yet Elder Scott, for example, when her Sister Scott passed away, he never remarried. And he even described some things in conference about we had talked about this even as she was nearing the end. And, she's still present with me in spiritual ways. So it's not a one-size-fits-all here. You have to keep that in mind. And some choose to remain single after a divorce or after your spouse passes away. Others get remarried. This is not a one-size-fits-all, and Paul admits that. He knows that. There's different gifts and so on. But the suggestion he gives, if you're a widow or widower, stay that way. You can work so hard. You can give God your all. Like I said, you can marry yourself to the ministry. And that's what Paul has done. Now, why do we say that Paul was most likely married? It's not spelled out in Scripture. Well, if he was a strict Pharisee, and Pharisees are as strict as they come with the law, well, guess what the very first commandment in the law was? Multiply and replenish the earth. Get married, Adam and Eve. Become one flesh. And the thought of Paul becoming such a Pharisee's Pharisee, working closely with the Sanhedrin to the point of being coat holder during the martyrdom of Stephen, the thought of him being single through all of that is kind of hard to even entertain that possibility. Now, he must have been married. But there's no talk of his wife now, and he's always off on missions and never even has a place to stay. He's like staying in the homes of other couples. Well, most likely he's a widower. But as far as he is concerned, it's allowed him, he's got no strings attached. The only strings that are attached to him are attached to the Lord and his service toward the Lord. Okay, married to the ministry, like I said. Now, with that in mind, keep reading. And in verse 10 and 11, unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. So this is not just me giving you my best advice. This is God giving you his law. And here it is. Let not the wife depart from her husband. This is like what we saw back in the Gospels. Jesus had strong words against divorce. Now, that doesn't mean there's no exceptions to that rule. Next line. But and if she depart. So divorce ought to be a but and if situation. A lamentable exception that the person did their best to avoid. But it needs to be an option when it's necessary. So, but and if she depart, let her remain unmarried. Stay that way. Or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. What's interesting there is this sense of, can you try to reconcile yourself? Can you try or stay unmarried? Now again, are we thinking, now we're back to the difficulty we saw in the Gospels. If you're divorced, you should never remarry because now you're committing adultery and so is your ex-spouse. We covered that back in the Gospels. Don't take it to that extreme. And same with this, because Paul is speaking to a specific situation, namely full-time missionary service. If you are in a but and if situation and you are divorced, and you're going to go out on full-time missionary service, then don't get remarried. And again, this is my best advice for you. Don't get remarried because now you got new responsibilities. And the responsibility on a mission is to the Lord. So either try to reconcile yourself to your spouse or just stay in the unmarried state. Again, in this circumstance. Now, he's also specific in the next verse, 12 through 14. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. So this is not apostolic exhortation. This is not thus saith the Lord. This is me giving you my best brotherly advice. If any brother, here's a church member, hath a wife that believeth not, so she's not a church member, and she be pleased to dwell with him, great, let him not put her away. And then flip around the genders. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and he be pleased to dwell with her, great again, let her not leave him. And then his takeaway principle, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. Now, I don't know of better advice to mixed faith marriages than these verses here in 1 Corinthians 7. Centering on verse 14, that lets you know there's still a chance for mutual sanctification. As long as one of you holds on firmly to the iron rod, with one hand, and then holds on lovingly to your unbelieving spouse with the other hand, and then, it's almost like sanctification by proxy. The living water can flow through you into them. If nothing else, they're at least not that far removed from the path that leads to the tree of life, because you're connecting both. You don't have to unplug from either. I certainly wouldn't let go of the iron rod so you can both drift away toward the great and spacious building. But neither should you automatically let go of your unbelieving spouse, because you don't know what will come in the future. Don't judge things before the time. Now, this is a fascinating passage, and it's becoming more and more applicable in our day, as in far too many couples, someone has struggled in their faith and left the church, and now you find yourself in a mixed faith marriage when you didn't start with one. And these ones are tough. The first thing we need to know here is this sense of sanctification. I can still be a blessing to my spouse, even though they left the church. Now, part of the challenge here is, can you stay together? The way Paul phrases it here, if he be pleased to dwell with her, or if she be pleased to dwell with him. I mean, think about when you got married. I hope that spiritual compatibility was part of what drew you to each other. But I also hope that wasn't the only thing. I mean, if we have dates, if we grow in wisdom and stature with favor in God and favor with man, I hope that some of your dates were in favor with God, but not all of them. I hope you had dates and courted each other in wisdom and stature and favor with man as well, okay? And if you no longer see eye to eye in the spiritual things, or maybe even back up, in the religious things, is there anything spiritual you can still agree on? Can you still have that as part of your relationship? If not, are there elements of truth you can still agree on? And again, are there other elements of the physical and the mental and the social that you can still be one on? Great, then stay together. Just because someone leaves the church doesn't automatically mean you've got to divorce them. Now, the tricky part comes when that separation comes with such anger or bitterness that the church becomes such a dividing point that it's tearing you apart. This often happens when someone is so angry about the church that the thought of you continuing in it tears me up. I'm really grateful that my mother-in-law has been so open about her life journey. She allows me to be open with it as well. Years ago, she was struggling with a lot of things about belief and struggling in her relationship with God, and finally said to her husband, I'm leaving the church. I'm having my name removed from the records. And my father-in-law's first question was, are you also planning to leave me? And thankfully, her answer was no. And thankfully, he wanted to hold on to her just like she wanted to hold on to him. They had many things in common beyond the religious side of things. And that's a good thing, because eventually things changed for her. Now, that's not always a guarantee, at least not in this life. But if you are pleased to dwell with one another, please, by all means, stay together, especially if children are in the picture. Divorce is hardest on them anyway. But what I love about the way the Lord puts it here, speaking of children, if it weren't this way, that one can help sanctify the other, then where does that leave your kids? Are your children then unclean? No, I consider them holy, which to me is beautiful. It's almost like there's a tie between the parents. One believes and one doesn't. Well, where does that put the kids? Well, in a tough situation. But as far as God is concerned, I think I'll round up. I think I'll side with the believer. Well, go figure. And rather than condemning this child for their difficult situation, I'm going to sanctify this child for doing their very best in a difficult circumstance. Your children can be holy. In some ways, focus on that in your relationship. And I would hope, as you're raising the children together, that the unbelieving spouse is okay with the believing spouse. I mean, this is going to come down to who feels stronger about things. And if the believer feels strongly about baptism and the unbeliever is okay with that, I'll support you in your faith. There's some good things about the church, and it provided me with a good background, and so yeah, it's fine for the kids. Just don't demand me to be a part of it. I'll come when they're baptized by grandpa. I'll come when they speak in church, whatever. It's not for me. On the other hand, if the unbelieving spouse is like, oh, they're not getting baptized over my dead body, oh, then that might, can we really dwell together if we both feel passionately about different things for the children? This is hard. It was actually about the children that Joseph Smith raised this same question to the Lord in section 74 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And I talked about this in length, 3 years ago when we did, or 2 years ago when we did that book. But section 74, Joseph asks a question about 1 Corinthians 7:14. It was not about interfaith marriage. It was about child baptism. Because what's interesting is in the Catholic world, 1 Corinthians 7:14 is a verse that they use to justify infant baptism. And you're like, how? Well, what they see here is like, wait a minute. You've got a tie in the parents. One of them holds on, the other one doesn't. But as long as one does, then the children can be holy. Otherwise, those children are unclean. So wait a minute. If there's no parent, at least not one believing parent drawing that child to the church, then where does that leave the child? In an unclean condition. See, original sin, I told you, that child must be unclean without baptism. So we better baptize them as quickly as we can. If they're damned without it, if they're unclean outside the church, then yeah, baptize them right away. Well, again, Protestants do we do that? I don't know. Latter-day Saints especially were wondering, and so Joseph asks the Lord the question. And by the end of that section, it's a short one, the Lord makes it crystal clear they don't have to be baptized in their infancy. They're alive through the atonement of Christ. Go back and reread Moroni chapter 8 in the Book of Mormon. He's got some strong language. But what I do love about section 74 is there's a couple of verses along the way that don't just confirm that children are clean, but also clarifies this concept of interfaith marriage and how to navigate that. Let me show you a few. Section 74, verse 3, for example, talks about great contention among the people in Corinth over this issue. It had to do with circumcision, because if you have an unbelieving Jewish parent that's demanding their sons be circumcised, well, what does that mean for the believing parent that's like, no, that's been fulfilled in Christ. We don't have to do that. And then in verse 4 and 6 of section 74, it talks about traditions, the traditions of the fathers. And do those have to be kept, or have they been fulfilled? And when it comes to circumcision, no, they've been fulfilled. What I love about that as far as making them applicable in our circumstance, if we find ourselves in a mixed faith marriage, think about, again, can we get along? Does it please ourselves to dwell with each other? Good thing to think about. What does it mean for the children? That's important to think about. No matter what, can we avoid great contention? That's going to be a key no matter what we do. We have to figure out how to agree to disagree without being disagreeable, for our sake as well as the children's sake. So that's one issue. And then the other is this tradition idea. That would be a helpful conversation, an ongoing conversation between the two parties. How much of our doctrinal differences aren't doctrine at all? It's just culture. How much of it is just the traditions of the fathers? And maybe it was that part of the church that I objected to, and yet that was just church culture anyway, and we don't have to live that way. We can raise our children together with doctrines more than traditions, and are you okay with that? There's a lot more we could say to this, and maybe it's worth going back and rewatching that part of the video on section 74, but if you find yourself in that situation, take some time to ponder what the Lord is teaching here, what Paul is giving us. But then let's go back and see the larger issue of what do we do about marriage and ministries and so on. Verse 15 through 17. Oh yeah, first he's got a couple more things to say to the mixed faith marriages. Forgot about that. Verse 15. If the unbelieving depart, let him depart. That's important to know too. If you just can't hold on to both the iron rod and your partner, because the partner keeps wiggling away from it, wants to be away from the path as far as they possibly can get, wants to pull everyone toward the great and spacious building, then you're not going to be punished or held responsible for a dissolved marriage that you were trying your hardest to keep together. If you can't make it work and the other person's determined to let those religious differences destroy the marriage, then you have to let them go. You're responsible for your agency, not theirs. The way Paul says it, a brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, for God hath called us to peace. And sadly, sometimes trying to keep the marriage together makes it impossible to keep the peace. You end up getting angrier and angrier at each other as you're living under the same roof instead of letting things go. That's what God wants for both parties, is peace. Contentions of the devil, he's made that crystal clear. So you're not under bondage. Paul goes on, for what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? That's an amazing statement. Who knows? I mean, people can change, right? So if you're allowed to divorce, but you decide not to, and we're going to try to work things out, but at all costs, I'm going to avoid contention. I've been called to peace, and I'll take the kids to church, and I'll let my spouse stay home. And I'm not going to bring it up every time, and I'm not going to hound them over their lost spirituality. I'm not going to try to guilt or shame them back into the gospel. That's not going to work anyway. So what should I do instead? Well, I'm called to peace, and who knows? Maybe I will sanctify my spouse. Maybe they will turn things around. If you can stay together and avoid contention and let patience have her perfect work, be the father of the prodigal son, be the spouse of the prodigal spouse, but stay firm and be loving and patient. Let them come to themselves. They'll know how to come home. In fact, they'll still be there with you in it, we hope. That's exactly what happened with my mother-in-law. Once she hit rock bottom and came to know the rock again, she's fully active. She's in our Stake Relief Society presidency. She's amazing, spiritual rock star. I love her. It's amazing to see how it came full circle. And my father-in-law is so grateful. He just kept holding on to both. Okay? With that in mind, verse 18 through 20. Now let's finally get back to this idea of marriage and missions and so on. Is any man called being circumcised? No, wait, where's this coming from? Well, I was just talking about believers and unbelievers, and people have been fighting over circumcision. Let me talk about that for just a second. If any man is called on a mission, that is, to full-time service, that is, if they're called being circumcised, great. Let him not become uncircumcised. And some of you are wondering, wait, is that even possible? Actually, yes. Remember we talked about that in our very first New Testament lesson? That because of the Hellenized culture and everybody wants to fit into Greek culture, that there were sadly some Jewish boys that felt so ashamed of their circumcision. There was a crude, primitive surgery you could have that made it look like you were actually uncircumcised. It kind of reversed the circumcision. And Paul's saying, you don't have to do that to try to look uncircumcised. Okay? Please don't do it. And then the flip side, is any called in uncircumcision? Well, that's great too. Let him not be circumcised. After all, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing but the keeping of the commandments of God. That's what matters now. So let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Now, you're again thinking, what does this have to do with marriages and missions? Well, we'll get there. He's just going to use, this is example number 1. He's then going to give example number 2. And example number 3 is what he's been aiming at the whole time. This first one is, be okay with what you are. If you're uncircumcised, stay that way. If you're circumcised, stay that way. You don't have to change the external. As long as you're keeping the commandments, go out and serve however you've been, in whatever state you started. Okay? I'm okay with circumcised missionaries and uncircumcised missionaries. It's not an issue. Just move forward. Next example, 21 through 24. Art thou called being a servant? Well, great. Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. In other words, if you really want to be free, then use your servant status to bless others spiritually. That's what real freedom entails. The way he puts it, for he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's freeman. Likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. Ye are bought with a price, like he said in a previous chapter. Be ye not the servants of men. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called, therein abide with God. Now that's a tricky passage because of all the wordplay there. But what he's talking about is freedom or slavery. It doesn't really matter. In some ways, it's all the same to the Lord, because if you're free physically, you're still supposed to be the servant of the Lord. And if you're a servant physically, you can still be spiritually free. You understand what I'm saying? What I'm really getting at in this second example is, don't worry about that kind of social status. I'm not worried about the physical status of circumcision or uncircumcision. I'm not worried about the social status of bond or free. If you're a servant and want to go serve if your master will let you. If you're free and want to go serve, then go free. You're free to do so. What I really care about is being a servant of God and abiding in whatever situation you started in. Okay, you don't have to change all those other things before you can go out and serve the Lord. Now, it's with that in mind, we're ready for the third example, which is what he's been aiming for all along, which is marriage. Marriage in a full-time ministry. Verse 25 and 26, now concerning virgins, and the Corinthian saints must have been wondering about virgins for him to bring it up here. Should they marry? Should they stay single? What do we do? Paul says, I have no commandment of the Lord. That's hard. I wish were crystal clear and we had set doctrine in here. We don't, so I'm doing the best I can as an apostle. So I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment, and it's the best judgment I've got. As one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful, so I trust myself. I hope you trust me too. But here's my thought. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. And if it's for the present distress, this is a specific circumstance. This is a short-term solution, okay? Just for now. I say that it is good for a man so to be. So to be what? Well, you asked about being a virgin. I'm saying that's a good thing. Now, wait a minute. Well, duh, it's a good thing to be a virgin. You just taught the law of chastity and kind of singed our eyebrows with it back in chapter 5 and chapter 6. Oh, no. I'm not talking about chastity versus unchastity. I'm talking about single versus married. Virginity is a good thing. And chastity, of course, is a good thing. I'm talking about people who are single versus people who are married. And my thought, and it's just my counsel, if you're an unmarried single person, that's what I mean by virgin, then my advice would be, stay that way. And here's why. He starts hinting at it in verse 27 and 28. Art thou bound unto a wife? Great, seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Then that's great too. Seek not a wife. Either way, you're fine. He says, but and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. Now that's super confusing. What are you talking about? Now the first part makes sense. If you're married, stay that way. If you're single, stay that way. Just like I said, if you're circumcised, stay that way. Or if you're uncircumcised, stay that way. Or if you're bond, stay that way. Or if you're free, stay that way. I'm not trying to get you to change any of those physical status or social status or marital status. My bigger focus is focusing on the work of the Lord. And in those circumstances, I would say to you who are not yet married, stay that way, because then you are free to serve with all your heart, might, mind, and strength, because there's no heart, might, mind, or strength going anywhere else. And again, this is service with no strings attached, no familial strings, no earthly responsibilities. That's what he's getting at with that trouble in the flesh. That's just temporal responsibilities. I'm trying to spare you from those things. In fact, the church is sparing us from those things in our day, because who does the Lord call? Young single missionaries and older empty nester missionaries. And who's off the hook? Who has been spared? People with families, that they're in the midst of raising them. That was not the day in Joseph Smith's day. Brigham Young's day. That was rough. Sick on the wagon, standing up to say hurrah to Israel. To whom? To their wives and children that were equally sick and suffering. That's rough. I'm grateful that we have been spared that in our day, because there are a lot of familial responsibilities that come. They're beautiful responsibilities. They're incredible blessings. But when it comes to full-time missionary service, that would be tough to do. So Paul suggests that they don't do it that way. But again, if you're betrothed, if you're married, then I'm not telling you to get divorced. And if you end up getting married before you go serve, that's not a sin either. Okay? And this is just counsel, my best advice. He then says in verse 29 to 31, "But this I say, brethren, the time is short." So again, it's counsel for the short-term situation, full-time missionary service, however long that lasts. It's not permanent. In the permanent, marriage is the ideal. We already know that. But here he says, "It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they have none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoiced not, and they that buy as though they possessed not. They that use the world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away." What was he saying there? Well, basically that everything's going to change eventually anyway. Jesus did promise us a new heaven and a new earth, and that's what we're trying to prepare the world for. There is this sense of urgency on Paul's part, and it's with that sense of the time being so short. If Christ is coming soon anyway, don't worry, you can get married in the millennium. But for now, let's get the work done. Let's usher in that final day. It's taken a lot longer than he expected. But there is this sense of, the time is short. So sprint. Run, and if it's faster to run on your own, then go for it. Okay? Full speed ahead. Now, through this all, like I said, this is for full-time missionary service. And if you didn't trust the chapter heading, and if you're still unsure because of the way Paul is saying this, if you still think, well, maybe celibacy really is the higher sacrament, well, here's the JST to make it crystal clear. Starting in verse 29, Joseph Smith's translation, "But I speak unto you who are called unto the ministry." You got it? "For this I say, brethren, the time that remaineth is but short, that ye shall be sent forth into the ministry." So your papers are in. Your call's coming any day now. So yeah, avoid marriage for that reason. Now he says, "Even they who have wives shall be as though they had none, for ye are called and chosen to do the Lord's work." So repeatedly in the inspired version. We're talking ministry here. And my advice to those who are ministers, full-time ministers, short-term ministers, is to marry yourself to the ministry and give it all you've got. As verse 32 tells us, and we'll start with JST's introduction. "I would, brethren, that ye magnify your calling." So yeah, he's still focused on that. But back to the King James. "I would have you without carefulness." And that carefulness is the kind of over-anxious concern that Jesus warned people about back in the Gospels. Remember when he said, "Take no thought beforehand"? That's the over-anxious care. Get past that. It's what Martha was struggling with. Okay? I don't want you to have to feel that. And then he explains, "He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord." I mean, what else has he got to worry about? How he may please the Lord. "But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife." I mean, he's got to. They're supposed to. That's a good thing to care about. You covenanted to care. Okay? The JST adds, "Therefore there is a difference, for he is hindered." We're just comparing married to single. They can both serve. It's just a matter of, are there hindrances? Is there carefulness? Is there difficulty here? The King James continues, "There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the world, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband." Again, keep it crystal clear. These are not wicked worldly cares, but they are important and unavoidable responsibilities. At simplest, it's easier to serve without those strings attached. So for the short term and a full-time mission, just run. Move forward. I was grateful that I had decided long before my mission, I didn't want to have any emotional strings attached. So no girlfriend for me as I headed off into the MTC. I had laid to rest and ended those relationships earlier. And I'm built for speed. I'm not going to get Dear John because I don't have a Jane at home. I just want to focus entirely. And thankfully I have a wife who is incredibly church broken, as Elder Holland once said of Sister Holland. who allows me to serve, at her expense at times. And I'm grateful for her willingness to do that. I'm grateful. You have been so kind, by the way, in your comments, to express your gratitude to my wife and children for sacrificing time with husband and father. They do. And I honor them for that as you have. Thank you for that. A few last verses in this chapter, or this lesson ends then. Verse 35 and 36. And this I speak for your profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you. I'm not trying to make it harder. I'm trying to make it easier. But that which is comely, that you may attend upon the Lord without distraction. See, I'm not trying to keep you on the leash permanently. I'm not trying to forbid marriage. No, that day will come, but go out and serve first. Then come home. You'll be ready to focus on something like a family. You'll be better prepared for it. He says, but if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him do what he will. He sinneth not, let them marry. Now that's a really weird verse. It's tricky. The New International Version says, if anyone is worried that he might not be behaving properly toward his fiancée, if his passions are too strong, and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. That goes back to that, it is better to marry than to burn. But there is this idea, it's not a sin to get married, believe me. It's, if you're feeling like the time is short and some have suggested this is in a situation of where you're already engaged. And I'm engaged and now I'm going to serve, what should I do? Well, it's up to you. If you can wait and if you feel she will, then go out and serve and come back and then get married. But here, if maybe you're too close physically, and the thought of postponing marriage, that's going to be too hard on you, or she's of age and she's ready to be married, then fine, be married. It's not a sin. It just might be tricky. And then to separate, to go out and serve. It's going to be as if the married now is not. She's going to feel like she doesn't have a husband. You're going to feel like you don't have a wife, but you do, and that can be emotionally difficult for both parties. My suggestion is to avoid it. Then he gives the opposite version in 37. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, fine, that you doeth well. If your mind's made up, if nothing's forcing you to marry right now, you have sufficient self-control, you want to stay engaged while you serve, then great, go for it. That's a good thing. And she'll be waiting for you. She'll be ready. Again, either way, Paul here is prioritizing focused, undistracted, laser-like service on the Lord. And then he ends the chapter, 38 through 40. So then he that giveth her, or the JST, giveth himself in marriage, doeth well. But he that giveth her, or JST, himself, not in marriage, doeth better. That's where Catholics say, see, celibacy is the higher sacrament and marriage comes in second. We would say, no, Paul is speaking of a specific situation. When it comes to full-time ministry, marry the ministry. That's better. If you're married to someone else and the ministry, that's still good. Okay, you're doing well. At least you're out serving. But as he puts it, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. Now, if you remember back in Romans, he used the same kind of language, but to teach a different principle. He was talking about the analogy of if you're married to the law, but then the law dies, you're now free to go get remarried to the gospel. Remember, I'm not cheating on Moses. Well, he's using the same language, but a different principle here. If this is literal, your spouse has died. So literally, you're at liberty to go marry whomever you will. If you want to marry somebody else, fine. But if you want to marry yourself to the Lord for a time and give him all you've got, be my guest. As he puts it, she is happier if she so abide. Well, after my judgment. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God, which is such a classic way to end this chapter. He's been really careful, and I'm grateful for Paul's carefulness. Sometimes it's tough to tell, like, is this a thus saith the Lord? Are you wearing your prophet hat or just your person hat? And Paul is trying to be crystal clear. When I'm speaking on God's behalf, when I'm just giving you my best personal advice. And here, as he ends it, this is my judgment. But I do love the kind of tongue-in-cheek at the end. But I'm pretty sure I've got the Spirit. I'm living as worthy as I can, and I feel strongly about this advice. I love church leaders and parents and prophets and apostles who do their best to live in tune with the Spirit of God, so that their advice, even if it falls short of "Thus saith the Lord," can be, "Thus whispereth the Spirit to me." Can we live in a discerning way so we're open to the whisperings of the Spirit and the counsel of God, even in areas that haven't been set out in stone with a "Thus saith the Lord"? There's going to be a lot of those as we navigate our own personal experiences. And we've seen some examples of that today. Now, I pray that our introduction to 1 Corinthians has been a blessing to you. I love these chapters. We spent a lot of time on epistemology and milk and meat and so on, marriage and mixed faith and so on. If I could just give you a quick run by way of review, as we do with the book of Romans, we're adding to our Pauline quote book. And he's got so many amazing one-liners. This time, I'm not even going to give you chapter and verse. I'm just going to reread the phrases that I hope will sink into your soul, linger a little longer in your mind. That ye be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. Not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. The foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. We have the mind of Christ. I have fed you with milk and not with meat. I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. The fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? Judge nothing before the time. Being reviled, we bless. Being persecuted, we suffer it. Being defamed, we entreat. And ye are puffed up, and have not rather mourned? Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Ye are not your own, for ye are bought with a price. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. God hath called us to peace, and I would have you without carefulness. My dear brothers and sisters, may we be careful in the Lord's way with the things that he wants us to be careful about. Can we be careful about milk and meat and know what to offer people and what they need? Can we be careful between the wisdom of man and the power of God? Can we be careful in our relationships and especially within our marriages? Can we give God all that we can? In some ways, let me just ask this final question, because it's my prayer that we can answer it in the Lord's way. Do we have the mind of Christ? Are we at least allowing him to develop it within us? Do we think like him and judge like him and love like him? Are we coming to know the Savior well enough that his thoughts are our thoughts? His ways are becoming our ways. And we truly are developing the heart, the might, and the mind of Christ.